So moving to the part one of this session on multi-level perspectives to understanding health, I'm going to start by discussing and presenting an overview of why we should care about the unit of analysis, or why levels of analyses are important within the framework, especially within for the sort of questions we raise and answer within social determinants of health. I'm going to do that by presenting you a historical context of two key scholars who sort of shaped epidemiology in a big way. One that you see is Ansel Keys, whose picture is on the cover of Time magazine, and he launched what was referred to as the 7-country study. And on your right, you have Professor Thomas Dauber, who launched the very famous the Framingham Heart Study. And there is a key difference. The common thing that binds both the studies was the common question. Both were interested in understanding what are the risk factors for cardiovascular disease, but they approached answering that question in a very, very different way. And just want to highlight that in order to drive home the message about how they were different in one big way, which was what's the target of inference and what's the unit of analysis. So if you, in the Framingham and comparing the Framingham Heart Study and the 7-country study, they both approximately started at the same time. So if you look at the slide, Framingham started in 1948, and 10 years later, the 7-country study was started. Framingham is one town in the state of Massachusetts, which is a suburb of the greater Boston area, while the 7-country study is, as the name implies, involves 7 countries, samples from 7 different countries: Yugoslavia, Italy, Greece, Finland, Netherlands, United States, and Japan. The inferential unit, what's the type of inferences you want to draw from your research? In the case of Framingham, was individuals. What do I mean by that? A question such as, why do some individuals develop hypertension and others don't? That's a kind of an individual level inferential question. While the case for 7-country study, what Ansel Keys were more interested in was at the population level. Why are the Americans have a much greater risk of with a high blood pressure distribution, and therefore being at the risk of developing hypertension, than the Japanese? So the focus was not so much within America or within Japan what's going on, which is the case with Framingham. They were interested in understanding what's happening within Framingham between individuals, while the focus for Ansel Keys was between populations, the Americans, the Japanese, the Dutch, and so on. The population variability, the fact that we are all different, the fact that populations vary, the Americans may have a very different diet, a different genetic makeup, a different healthcare system compared to those in Japan, that sort of variability was a nuisance, because when you're trying to understand individual determinants, what predicts my risk of a heart attack, that's any source of variability is a source of confounder. While for the case of Ansel Keys, that was precisely the question: why are the Japanese better off than the Americans, and so on? So the population variability was a nuisance in one instance and of substantive interest in the other case. And finally, with the unit of analysis, even though both collected data at the individual level, individuals were interviewed, individuals were measured, individuals were asked several questions that relates to risk factors, cardiovascular disease, and a bunch of other questions. But what level did they analyze the data? So in the case of Framingham, the unit of analysis was individuals, while in the case of the 7-country study, because there was an explicit interest in the populations, Ansel Keys and his team of investigators decided to analyze that data at the ecological level. With that very broad introduction, let me move on to sort of building on that last point of the unit of analysis, the individuals and the ecological. The ecological being the Ansel Keys study analytical design, and the individual being the Framingham study design. And from the Ansel Keys study, while the big contributions came out, a major critique of Ansel Keys was what you may have heard this terminology as ecological fallacy. So let me sort of move on to that term, the origin of that term ecological fallacy. The idea of ecological fallacy, which is essentially can be defined as the invalid transfer of results observed at the level of ecologies to the individuals, is what we call as ecological fallacy. So when Ansel Keys analyzed his data at the country level, and then there was an implicit inference that this would apply to individuals, although he did not make that, his interpretation did not have an ecological fallacy, but the analysis was potentially open to that fallacy by people who read it. So the origin of the ecological fallacy can be traced back to the work of Robinson, who in a 1950 classic article titled "The Ecological Correlations in the Behavior of Individuals" articulated this point in a very extremely elegant and simple manner. So what did Robinson demonstrate? So he took two variables. He took a variable which was illiteracy, so the lack of ability to read or write, and he took a variable race. And he computed a simple correlation between these two variables. So whether an individual is illiterate or not, 1 or 0, whether the individual is black or not, 1 or 0, and then he computed a correlation between the two, and the correlation, by analyzing the data at the individual level, was 0.2. So it was a positive correlation. Individuals who are black are more likely to be illiterate. Okay. Then he took the same two variables, but then he aggregated them up to the level of the state. So now it's an ecological correlation at the state level, the ecology being the state. So now the two variables that he was correlating was proportion of people or percentage of people who are illiterate in a given state and the percentage of people who are black in a given state. And when you correlate these two, the correlation that he found was positive and very strong, 0.77. Now, how would you interpret the second correlation? You can, if you say that based on the second correlation, the ecological correlation, you infer about the individuals, then that would be committing the ecological fallacy. So the interpretation for the second correlation, ecological correlation, is that states that had a higher fraction of black population tends to have a higher proportion of illiterates. While the first correlation for the individual level was individuals who are black tend to have a higher, tend to be more likely to be illiterate. So clearly you can see that the results did not align in this particular instance. There was a huge difference in terms of the magnitude of the association. He went on further to take another example of two variables, illiteracy and nativity, whether the individual is born in the US, United States, or outside of the United States. Of course, this comes from 1930 US Census data, and at that point, all the foreign born were mainly white foreign born, okay, so it's from Europe. And again, at the individual level, you find a positive correlation. So individuals who are foreign born tend to have a higher likelihood of being illiterate. And at the state level, the correlation actually flips. Really conveying this point that level of analysis matter. So imagine if you were doing an analysis at the level of the state and you find a negative correlation. What does that mean? That states that have a higher proportion of individuals who are foreign born tend to have lower illiteracy. However, at the individual level, it's reversed. It's a positive correlation. So if you're an individual, you have a higher likelihood. If you're an individual who is foreign born, you have a higher likelihood of being illiterate. So what he showed with these two very elegant empirical examples and very powerful empirical examples is that the magnitude of the association between two variables, and sometimes the sign of the association, where you can completely get a misleading inference. If you're interested in the individuals and then you analyze the data at the state level, you can get a very misleading inference. For example, if in the case of the correlation, the association between illiteracy and foreign born status. So Robinson very elegantly basically demonstrated a very key aspect, which is that the unit of analysis matters. Okay. Unit of analysis matters. They are not interchangeable. So that's the one big lesson that Robinson provided, both empirically, and if you read this paper, also he has an elegant mathematical proof as to why this may occur. However, he went a step further and then he arrived at some conclusions. Here he concluded that the ecological correlations, the correlations that we observed at the state level, or the type of correlations that Ansel Keys reported in his paper, and he concluded verbatim, the purpose of this paper will have been accomplished if it prevents the future computation of meaningless correlations. So for Robinson, he made an inference here where he said that the correlations that we observe at the state level are not meaningful at all. They are actually meaningless. On the other hand, on the quote, the individual relationship or relationship that was observed using individual data, he stated that the purpose of this paper will have been accomplished if it stimulates the study of similar problems with the use of meaningful correlation between properties of individuals. You can think about Ansel Keys as being the first point on the ecological correlations and the individual relationship being the Framingham. And Framingham continues. It's in its 8th or 9th wave. It's a very successful study. We have learned a lot. But Ansel Keys, pretty much that study was died down. And it's quite telling the impact that this sort of, the notion of ecological fallacy, how bad it could be if we analyze data at the ecological level, is very obvious from what we observe as a trend in epidemiological analysis since the 1970s onwards. But one can critique Robinson in the following way. One could argue that his conclusions are not supported by the analysis. What his analysis showed was that results depend on what level you analyze your data. But it does not tell you which of those levels are clinically or substantively important. So to derive this notion that one result is more important than the others is not quite what the analysis was about. All the analysis shows that correlations differ. Sometimes even the sign of the correlation differs, and that's the main conclusion, but not which of those correlations was more important, which is what the conclusion of Robinson was. And there's also a questionable assumption that I think is a fair, which the social determinants of health approach brings to the table, brings to the epidemiological discussion in a broad way, that we often assume that every time we look at any ecological correlation, the purpose is to draw something about the individuals. Well, I think Ansel Keys really had that right, or Jeffrey Rose had that right, and they brought that theoretical approach. That is not always the case. We might be interested in individuals, but often we are also interested in populations. There are entire fields of study and investigations in social sciences, ecology, that are about ecologies. The target of inference is not individuals, but the ecologies or the states or the countries and so on. So it's a questionable assumption that every time we do an analysis, it's always about understanding something about the individuals. It could be the case, but it's not always the case. And finally, it conflates the principle of ecology with the problem of aggregation. And this more fundamental idea that, for example, in the case of Robinson's analysis, the state as a unit was simply seen as an aggregate of individuals. But you can always make the case that the state is more than sum of its parts, more than a sum of its individuals. When you bring in that idea that the whole is not simply the sum of its parts, but somewhat more, that's the notion of ecology. But when the whole is exactly the sum of the parts, that's aggregation. So there was a sort of an inherent conflation of these two. One is a substantive question, one is a technical problem that we need to be aware about. Robinson's paper had a very a long reach. It was third most cited paper in the American Sociological Review. Dire warnings of ecological fallacy are very common. If you go to any 101 in EPI or 201, graduate schools, this is the first thing that you would know. Ecological analysis, bad way to go. You want to do everything at the individual level. And finally, the basic idea was, if you want to know about individuals, let's go and ask individuals a bunch of questions. And it motivated this sort of stimulated this collection of individual survey data. So in the rest of this first module, I'm going to sort of reanalyze that we conducted a reanalysis with the co-authors Kelvin Jones, Afamia, and Dr. Krieger on trying to emphasize the importance of both the individuals and the state, especially when it came to illiteracy. So let me sort of walk you through that. The data that Robinson had, we exactly used the same data. It came from the 1930 US Census. At that time, in the US, about 100 million individuals. The outcome of this analysis was, is the individual illiterate or not? The predictors that we had multiple predictors at different levels. At the individual level, we had race and nativity. And at the state level, we had the proportion of population who are black, so kind of an aggregated variable that defines the racial context of the state. And also we had a variable which we defined as a policy variable to get at this idea that states are not simply sum of individuals, okay, which is the idea behind proportion black population. But there are policies that happen at the state, and Jim Crow, whether a state had a Jim Crow policy or not, was one of the interest, and I'll talk a little bit more about the Jim Crow policy when I get to that slide. And then we applied a multi-level model with a particular algorithm that was appropriate for this data. So some of the key results. So in this slide, what you see is the regression equivalent, the odds ratio kind of logistic regression equivalent of what Robinson presented as simple correlations, essentially the same thing. And there are two odds ratios presented here. In one of the odds ratios is where you see the 11.66. So that basically tells you, under a model where we ignore the fact that these 100 million individuals are nested within 48 states, they come from different states, we ignore that information. We just say that there are 100 million individuals in the US and we treat them as one large sample. If I do the analysis in that way, which is equivalent to doing the individual level correlation, what you find is that the blacks are about 12 times at a greater risk of being illiterate compared to native whites. In the second column, in that result, you see that once I account these, adjust my regression for the states, and I can do that adjustment using a multi-level model, which we will discuss about, or by treating state as a variable. You know, I can put in 49 dummy variables in my regression model and say, you know, I've adjusted for these states. So when I do that, the black coefficient dramatically alters. It becomes from an increased risk of 12 times, it comes down to about 6 times. And the main point that I want to emphasize here is that even if you're interested in only the individual level association, which in this instance is your race and ethnicity, is your race and nativity associated with your propensity to be illiterate, even that, it's conditional, it changes depending on whether you consider the ecology of states or not. So that's the main point. So if you're just ignoring the states, it's not an option out because the results do change. Which of these two correlations are you going to consider for analysis? So you cannot ignore the ecology within which individuals live, work, play, etc., or get educated in this instance. In this slide, I'm taking a sort of the ecological view from a regression standpoint, from a multi-level regression standpoint. So what you see on the y-axis on this slide is essentially a between-state variation. Okay? Think about this as a standard deviation. How much do states vary in terms of illiteracy? It's expressed in logits because that's the model. And then you have two bars that you can see. The gray bar is plotting the variance between states. How much do states vary? If it's 0, they don't vary at all, and anything above 0 means there is variation. What you see is that there is variation between states in a model that does not control for anything. And then the yellow or the orange bar that you see, when I account for who lives in those states with regards to race, it still doesn't change. So what am I trying to get here? What you can see is there are two bars. The idea is that there would be state variation in illiteracy. And the question that you ask yourself is, okay, is that state variation because some states tend to have a higher proportion of black population? And because you already know that black populations have a higher risk of being illiterate, is that the reason why that state has a high illiteracy? Or is it independent of that? If it's independent of that, then you're beginning to attribute some sort of an influence to the state level. So that's what you see in the orange bar, that independent of the racial distribution of the states, there was still a lot of variability between states in terms of illiteracy, suggesting that states may matter for illiteracy. So the ecology of states was not all that meaningless. We can extend this idea a little bit further to introduce these notions of contextuality. So what's shown in this slide here are the association between illiteracy and race. It's illustrative in this particular slide, and we can view that from two lenses. You know, how much do states vary, but differently for different groups, and is the ordering of the states similar for both the groups? So what you see here and what we find when you analyze the data is there's a much more variability, much greater variability between states for native whites as opposed to black. So if you're black, you more or less have the same probability, not the same probability, there's still variability, but considerably less variability as opposed to states, as opposed to native whites. At the same time, if you look at the ordering, what you see is that the states that are the highest in illiteracy for one group is not necessarily the state with the highest for the other group. So there's a complex geography of illiteracy that's interacting with race. So there is illiteracy, there is some role of state because you're seeing this differential variability, and native whites and blacks. Another way of sort of thinking about this notion of heterogeneity by different groups is presented in these two maps. The two maps here basically are plotting the state level variability around its mean. So for example, the native white map that you see on the left hand side, to my left hand side of this slide, you see that if I treat the mean illiteracy for the native whites in the US as a reference, and then I plot states that are significantly higher or lower, and I do the same thing for the blacks. So the point that I want to make in this slide is the following. If you look at the figure 1 in the legend, that orangish, the bright orange figure, that number, what we would expect, that's the mean, that's the mean native white. We want a majority, a 60% of that states to have that color in both the maps, which is essentially telling you those are the typical states, and then there would be some that would be higher than, which is the light orange, and then there would be some darker than that, the darker orange. But what you find in both the maps is the average is literally not found anywhere. There is so much heterogeneity around that average. That average is a very misleading description without any sense of getting how much variability exists. And hence this phrase that my colleague and friend Kelvin Jones highlighted, this notion of everywhere, that's the notion of average, is nowhere. So this notion of average is just a statistical myth which we can't observe anywhere. And if that's true in certain data, then it's completely misleading to only focus on that average. Moving on to another dimension of looking at the context which Robinson had is this distinction between, he equated that individual race and the proportion of blacks in a particular state are more or less the same variable. But there is a lot of literature around that they could be very different. So one is capturing the individual's experiences of being of a particular color, and the racial context is capturing what's happening in that whole state. So here, that as you can see, they're not equal and there's an independent effect. So on the y-axis, you see the probability of being illiterate. On the x-axis, you see the proportion of people who are black in a particular state, and those three lines represent the three groups. So those are the individual groups. And what you find is that as you move into states that are predominantly black, the probability of being illiterate increases, and it increases very dramatically for blacks. So blacks are at a greater risk of being illiterate at every level, but particularly in states that have a higher proportion, there's a double jeopardy. So being black is a risk factor, and living in a state is also a risk factor in a multiplicative way. There's also a spillover effect of proportion black population on native whites, such that if you're a native white living in a more predominantly black state, you tend to be more likely to be illiterate. No association was observed between proportion black and the foreign-born white. As I said, this takes a view that proportion black is largely an aggregated variable. I'm just aggregating individuals, and states are simply aggregates of individuals, which was one view that Robinson implicitly had. But states in the US, and especially within the context of illiteracy, are also policy level units. States do things that could matter for whether I'm in school, whether I'm able to read or write, and so on. And this is where we sort of examine the effect of Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws were, in a very brief way, the paper that we cite before, you could read that for a more elaborate description. But these are essentially certain states adopted this what was referred to as a Jim Crow laws, which were essentially the federal and state laws that permitted racial discrimination under the concept of separate but equal. So racial discrimination or segregation was legalized in certain states while it was not legal in other states. And this was done with this notion that if we keep everything separate, then that's promoting equality. That was at least the notion. And obviously, I can throw like a million pictures. If you Google, reality was hardly unequal. So not only here you see that it's separated. Well, that's okay. But if you look at the quality of the water cooler, that's clearly a water cooler, while that's basically a piped water supply. It's not cooled. So the quality does vary. And of course, everywhere there was also a distinct difference. So the notion that it was separate and equal is kind of not quite true. What in reality was happening was it was separate and unequal. So if you look at a variable, for example, we looked at several variables, but if you look at a variable that we might think is important for illiteracy, it's the per capita educational expenditure. So how do states spend, or how much do states spend for in schools, which is one pathway through which people become literate in the more conventional sense. And what you basically find is that, just taking two examples, two counties from the state of Georgia and Alabama, there was a dramatic difference. So the per capita educational expenditure in a county in Alabama for the white schools with only white kids was $26. This is 1930, while it was $4 for the colored child. So almost like an 8-9-fold difference in terms of the investment. And you might think that that would have some impact on on illiteracy levels. And this is sort of a very quick map of the states that had the Jim Crow laws, were mainly the southern states. And we're doing some work where you can take any current map of the US, any health variation map, and you pretty much still find the same patterns. Those are the areas that continue to lag behind for for most of the outcomes, socioeconomic outcomes, as well as health outcomes. So what does the correlation between Jim Crow laws and race impacts? How does it impact on illiteracy? So on the y-axis, again, you have the predicted probability of being illiterate. And for the two groups, the blacks and the native whites, the orange bar here tells us about the effect of Jim Crow states, and the blue bar tells us the non-Jim Crow states. So as you can see that the probability of being illiterate for both the groups were substantially higher in Jim Crow states. So if you compare the blacks in the non-Jim Crow states, those states that did not permit a legal segregation, legal racial discrimination, had a much lower probability of being illiterate compared to those that did allow, that legalized that. As I said, there was also a spillover effect on native whites. So to sort of summarize this talk, the problem with the Robinson analysis, and I would probably take that a step further, for many epidemiological analyses, it was the idea of thinking at only one level, that only one level matters. And if you take that approach, at the least, you come up with a very impoverished description of the data. If I take at the worst, you could come to a very misleading interpretation, as was the case with illiteracy. And in summary, the take-home message from the module 1, the part 1 of the session, is that the level or unit of analyses matters. So give serious consideration to what's the unit of analysis, what's the level of analysis, are there multiple units of analysis, which is the problem. More broadly, generalizing that issue, what are the levels of analysis that you have not observed or you cannot observe prior to doing your analysis. So this was a sort of a brief motivation to sort of emphasize the importance of units and analysis. Thank you.